Hare Krishna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be watching in the world. Welcome to the Vedic Inquirer, another episode. This episode's a little different. This is not an expose on a particular piece of misbehavior. This is actually a proactive um, PSA, really, public service announcement. How might we spot problems before they develop and fructify? What are the warning signs to look out for? How do we support people and so on? I'm delighted to be joined by Nitai Joseph, who's an expert in this field. Nitai, why don't you give us a quick overview of what you intend to talk about?
Yeah, I maybe if you want to show the slides, I
Yeah,
can
I can do that.
quickly show. So what I'd like for us to cover today is sort of as much as possible and have useful takeaways for everyone. So we'll do some brief discussion of some definitions and general stats, talking more in depth about really understanding what is abuse, what effect it has, and betrayal. Looking at some of the warning signs, talking about some of the risks, both in general and then unique risks that exist within ISKCON. Then sort of go a step deeper into institutional betrayal and institutional courage and sort of what happens once these issues go beyond just being interpersonal. And then maybe we'll talk kind of openly about ideas for next steps, things that people might start doing to try to affect broader change that so many people want, and then some resources to explore at the end.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate you putting this effort in. And you gave me the background the other day that, this is a field that you've got education in, you've worked in professionally. Could you tell us a little bit about that background?
Yeah, I for several years now have worked in realms of abuse recovery, looking at interpersonal influence, extremist ideologies and things. But ultimately, my degree was in the study of the psychology of coercive control, which is really looking at how does prolonged abuse take place over in multiple settings: human trafficking, domestic violence, child sexual abuse, etc. In the course of that degree, I wrote some school papers about child abuse within ISKCON and within the Catholic Church, and did quite a bit of work that touches on these issues. And then since finishing that degree, which was early 2020, I've worked at a child sexual abuse prevention organization, and I'm the program and research manager. So I spend my time digging into research, consolidating it, turning it into trainings for parents and teachers and mental health professionals and nurses and things like that. And before I forget, I should say at the outset that I'm just here as myself. I'm not here representing the organization I work for or anything.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's go back to your slideshow and what I might do with your permission in between each sort of section. I might ask you a bunch of questions. Obviously, if you're watching, and please share, but please comment and please ask questions, and we'll also deal with those as we go. But back to you, Nitai.
Yeah, and then I guess I'll just give some context for myself. Obviously, my name is Nitai. My parents were both um, disciples of Prabhupada. My father, famous or infamous, depending on your stance, Kundali, and my mother's name was Govinda Balaba. Um, I am not particularly devotional at this point in my life, but I work on these issues and I care about children. I care about this community. And so my presence here today is really about I have something that could help people I uniquely care about experience less harm. And so I want to offer that to everyone.
Well, and also as ISKCON alumni, if we can call you that, you absolutely have insights to the dynamics in the society. So it's not that you're just from some secular place; you're bridging both worlds. So that's a really unique position, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, and I hope that that can be beneficial. And at times it may be challenging, just not so significantly, but like I think one of the things I can offer is I can also bring this broader frame of reference outside perspective and contextualize it into these situations.
Thanks. All right, let's go.
All right. So looking at some definitions and general stats, and I should also say I put this PowerPoint together pretty quickly in advance for this, so forgive me, everyone, if I'm a little disorganized at times. CSA is child sexual abuse, and when we go to define it, it is not easy. There's a lot of different definitions in operation. There's World Health Organization, there's here in America the Centers for Disease Control, there's other governmental agencies, there's nonprofits, there's legal think tanks. All of them may have somewhat different definitions. What I've chose to include here is basically the CDC definition with some tweaking, and then I will also expand on this in the next slides. So here it says child sexual abuse refers to any sexual acts between an adult and child, or the involvement of a child in acts that he or she does not fully comprehend, does not consent to, is unable to give informed consent to, or is not developmentally prepared for and cannot give consent to.
Can I just ask a question? Because,
Yes.
you know, we probably hear about sexual abuse more than other forms, but there are physical abuse and neglect and psychological abuse and pastoral abuse and so on. Is there any data about the relative harmfulness, impacts on victims sort of lifelong? Is sexual abuse more grievous in terms of its effects, or is it vary significantly?
We'll get into some of that. I would say that very often it is uniquely harmful, but the reasons that is often maybe different or more complex than we tend to think about, which I'll sort of dive into in these other slides. It's also the case that many of these forms of abuse coexist. So where one occurs, it's increased likelihood that one of the others might occur as well. Yeah, that's a good point to also acknowledge, though. Here, we're largely today talking about child sexual abuse. A lot of these dynamics do apply to those because, as I'll sort of say, the central thread is the betrayal, is the dual relationship with the person who is causing harm, because that's not supposed to be the premise of the relationship. Versus if someone is assaulted by a stranger and it's a one-time incident, or beat up by a stranger and it's a one-time incident. And so that's what we'll get into with the betrayal trauma stuff. Here, I just want to point out, the details really matter. So it talks about does not give consent to, is unable to give informed consent to. What these things constitute really matters. We're talking about power differentials, maybe within a setting. So within a school, that changes the ability of one person to consent, because if there are threats or negative implications of refusing, there can't be full consent. And so all these different factors start to affect it, potentially developmental stages of a child or developmental delays also.
Well, you talked of betrayal, and obviously, if someone is meant to be a spiritual, elevated person, and someone who's the child has been put in the care of actually commits that abuse, that's already quite deranging. Feeling like, well, why did my parents send me to this person and trust me to this person can be deranging. We also have a society where speaking ill of sadhus is absolutely disparaged. And so even the ability to report or even entertain negative thoughts, all of these things are problematic.
Yes. And we're going to go in some depth into
Okay,
that, because I think
fantastic.
that's really important. So to go a little further, CSA, child sexual abuse, includes contact abuse, which is what we typically think of when we talk about it. But there's also non-contact forms of abuse. So voyeurism, observing a child, exposing oneself to a child, forcing a child to watch pornography. And then there's also technology facilitated abuse is sometimes the term used, which might mean that you're not even in physical proximity, but you're forcing or coercing a child to send images of themselves. You're sending inappropriate images of yourself or links to pornography, similar principles there.
Well, and sometimes we hear those seeking to defend abusers, if there wasn't actually something as complete as penetration, then they argue, oh, well, it wasn't such a big deal. You should just be able to get over it and so on. Again, is there data that indicates that even what we might consider milder forms is still fundamentally traumatizing and damaging and so on?
Well, yes, there is gradation though as well. And so we don't want to say because all of these things come under the heading of child sexual abuse that if a child experiences any of them at any time, they are maximally traumatized. We don't want to assume that either. There is a difference between receiving an image from an adult congregation member, let's say, that you didn't want if you're a child, and actually being physically alone in a room and pursued or abused by that person. So gradation is important, but again, we'll see. Part of the big issue is we talk about and understand this around the act of abuse. And that's because that's what can be litigated in courts. That's what allows us to pursue societal justice with the power of the state behind us is sort of litigating, did this momentary act occur? But the impact for the abused is much more complex and shared between these different types of abuse because it's about this relational harm. So in defining it, there's a few important distinctions to also make. Not all, this is a very kind of widespread misunderstanding or simplistic understanding, whether we're talking about among devotees or not. Not all CSA perpetration is quote unquote pedophilia. Pedophilia technically refers to a sexual attraction toward minors. And it is not the case that all who commit acts of sexual abuse to minors have that inherent sexual attraction or have that exclusively. And so it's not that someone who's experiencing some inclination is inherently destined to perpetrate. And this is important to understand because this is one of the most awful things, if not the most awful thing that occurs. And so we really resist sort of thinking about it in a little more nuance, but we need to understand this because the reality is people who potentially offend are not destined to do that. And so there are circumstances environmentally within the organization, et cetera, that actually can make up the difference. The Catholic Church, and I would argue ISKCON and others, would prefer what's sometimes called the bad apple explanation, which is sort of like, this is a problem in this person, and the only way of preventing it would have been to know that they had that evil in them and cut them off. But what the actual solutions are a lot more mild, systems based, etc. For a lot of people. That is not to say that you can fully remove abuse, but we can make much headway.
Can I just explore? Sorry, go ahead.
This is just the second. Another really important distinction is to understand that abusive behavior from one child to another, what is now called here in America problematic sexual behavior, is not inherently the same as abusive behavior perpetrated by an adult. And what research shows is that for many children who act in this way and potentially harm another child, these are behavioral, developmental issues that can be addressed like we might address things like hitting, etc. And so if we have instances of kids sort of perpetrating these things, they need support and care too. It's very important to protect a kid who's been harmed, But if at a societal level, these issues are appearing among minors and not being addressed, those can mature into more systemic abuse. That could mature into that person who didn't get support about their misbehavior becoming an abusive partner in the future, for example.
Can we just go back one slide for a second
Yes.
to that definition of pedophilia? Because I think that there was confusion in some people when the GBC referred the Loconath matter to the CAP associates to do some professional assessment. I don't know exactly what they did, maybe ink blot tests or some other things, but they came to the conclusion that he wasn't a pedophile. And in some people's minds, that meant they exonerated him entirely of having committed the abuse and said it wasn't possible. They also spoke of this unusual constellation of events, if that's the right, languaging around it. So they sort of said, this wasn't something dirty inside him, but it was somehow circumstantially brought about. Obviously, this has caused a lot of concern amongst devotees because it feels like the whole thing is being played down and he's being excused as if he had no agency in the matter and he was a victim himself or whatever. I mean, I don't, want to compromise you in terms of having a specific comment on that case, but I'd love you to just to talk us through all of those different strands and how you might unravel them.
Yeah, I think those assessments are to be consider. These details far more than I've been aware at times. I know that like maybe one of the people they commissioned to do that has a history of doing a similar thing for like the Catholic Church, etc.
Yeah, Ken
Like
Cullen.
one of the things that leadership wants to do in issues like this is say like, oh, we did a process and therefore we're exonerated. We're like, it's sort of like we've given the power of whether or not this person is moral and should continue to be a guru and subsequently to this outsider expert. I would say it doesn't matter if we're talking about pedophilia as this deep in built sort of attraction to minors. It doesn't matter if that's present or not. If the event occurred, it occurred, and it has a lot of implications about the appropriateness of someone to be a leader, about how that should be addressed, etc. And in a sense, debating motive, circumstance, is it because he's been around women so little that is like that's less important and might actually distract from the issue, which is a lack of justice and, more equally important, like a lack of change to prevent repeat situations.
And much is made of very low recidivism, or sorry, very high recidivism, whatever the right term is, that people repeat offend, and it's very rare that these items just happen in isolation.
That this is a good point also, that because it is assumed that anyone who has offended is a pedophile, it is assumed that this is like a lifelong, they're like ever scheming, like to find the opportunities and the environments. And yes, such people exist, but the notion that everyone who's offended is those is incorrect.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
So yes, I wanted to mention this about problematic sexual behavior, because one of the things that happens, as we know, in systemic abuse is it then becomes sort of generationalized, and children are sometimes repeating what they know. Looking at some stats, just briefly, these are very general, and I will add the caveat. These are largely, if not entirely, USA based, but I just want to give some sort of bearings. I tried to look into a little Indian data. I don't think it's reliable around like prevalence estimates around child sexual abuse, etc. So I'm going with the ones that I'm more familiar with and kind of use in my day-to-day.
And this is also only reported, so there's a good chance that there may be higher incidence even here in the States.
Yes, no, that is the
reported.
assumption. And also I'll spare you the long methodological rant I could go into about how these prevalence estimates are ascertained and how difficult it is to be accurate, especially when we're considering this is the most secretive type of behavior that we have in the world. Just like it's very hard to study domestic violence because it's a private thing, this is that even more so. So some of the stats, approximately 1 in 10 children will experience contact abuse as opposed to those non-contact forms before the age of 18. That is an average number between boys and girls. The specific stat, I don't know if I can remember off the top of my head. I believe it is closer to 1 in 6 girls and 1 in 14 boys, which averages out to about 1 in 10, something like that. I'm a little off. 90% of abusers are known to the child who is abused. I heard in the recent recording that Jayapataka Swami even mentioned, I think, this specific stat. It's one of the more well-known ones, and it's very, very important for the things we're going to talk about next, because it's this relationship that really matters. And then 60%, in 60% of reported cases, as you mentioned, the abuser is considered a trusted person by the family. There's also a significant amount of abuse that occurs within families. The likelihood of child sexual abuse increases 10 times for those not living with their parents. So maybe that's boarding school environments, also like foster care. And 80% of abuse incidents occur in isolated settings. So when we start to move to talk about what can change, if we're talking about contact abuse, one of the things that can change is systems, processes, and even the physical building design that reduces, if not ultimately eliminating, one-on-one child-adult interactions. And this can seem like excessive to people, but this is where contemporary cultures, at least here in North America and I know in the UK, etc., are going. So in the trainings I do, we talk to parents and teachers or coaches about the last kid on the team is left behind and can't get picked up by their parents, so the coach has to drive them home, but that's a one-on-one situation. So what do? Maybe they call the parent on the phone and they talk on the phone during the drive, or they call their supervisor. Like what seems excessive because there's already a culture of apathy can become normalized and easy and systematized over time. And that one shift would potentially prevent a lot of abuse from happening if that becomes the standard.
I may be jumping ahead here, but in your experience, are ISKCON parents typically more lax and trusting than the average population?
I wouldn't. I don't think I would speculate. I think it's very hard. I see a wide variance in ISKCON. What I do think is that devotee culture is less sexually informed and less likely to set the precedent for open discussion about this kind of thing with children, which is one of the important ways of preventing or intervening once it's already occurred. So a sort of discomfort around sexuality broadly can become a liability to safety, and a lack, and this will be discussed later, a lack of proactive education about what would be considered an age appropriate and okay form of intimacy, especially like now if we're talking about like adolescents, like they're aging into having those feelings. And if we've never talked about any form of of sort of legitimate okay behavior, it's harder to identify what isn't okay. So I think that's liabilities of I would say more devout and conservative religious communities broadly.
Another stat I've heard, and I may have not got this completely right, is many people report much later in life, something like the average age being 52 or something. So many years later. And of course, sometimes again, those gaslighting or just unfamiliar will say, well, you know, if it was such a big deal, why did they wait? Why didn't they report it at the time? Why didn't they take him to court? All these kind of things. What's your view about why there is this kind of delay, and how we should respond? What are helpful, supportive versus problematic responses?
To the second part about helpful responses, that will come later. As far as the delay, yes, you're right. There's a stat. I believe what it technically is if a child does not report around the time of the incident, the average age of disclosure then becomes 52. And again, we're speaking to a global audience, and that data is from specific places, but it's a very large phenomenon. At my day job, we provide like small counseling grants to people in our region, adults who experience child sexual abuse, specifically on the understanding that so many have never pursued care earlier for like recovery support. And so there's many factors there. One is, I mean, the deepest one is that abuse is obscured in these situations. And so even piecing it together is a process. Then you piece it together and maybe you don't expect your family to even believe you or support you, or they are going to believe and support you, and that's going to be the destruction of everyone's notion of this family. Let's say you were abused by an uncle. And so like the implications are monumental. At certain points, you may believe this is special care. This is part of the grooming manipulation process, that this was a good thing. Or, you know, yeah, maybe in typical instances that's abuse, but like I did consent to it. I'm different. And then something happens in life, you get a kind of deeper understanding of power dynamics, and there's like the overwhelming realization that what I thought was somehow okay, maybe even good, was actually deeply wrong and actually harmed me in ways that I'm only now piecing together. And we'll see some quotes about that. So I think I'll stop there because we'll cover some.
Yeah, thank you. And here's just Saraswati mentioning same thing. The debate as to whether someone's a pedophile or not is actually a distraction, and just echoing really what you said.
Beautiful. Yeah, exactly. I want to touch on this, but abuse happens everywhere sort of response. Yes, these sort of things happen everywhere if we're talking about any sort of group level. How much they happen and how they're responded to are not just equal. It happens everywhere at roughly the same rates. The culture doesn't matter, etc. That's the misunderstanding or distraction in this response, but abuse happens everywhere. So some potential causes of increased frequency of abuse: private and boarding schools, the smallness, relative to other religions, makes it so there just is less scrutiny internally and externally, like versus in contrast, let's say the Catholic Church, where they are so large that they are inherently a relevant consideration to the politics of the country that they're in and to sort of larger lawmaking institutions and things like that. In a smaller group, you don't have that. And so that, I think, can be an increased liability. We touched on this, but the sexual taboos and then the deep moral value attached to celibacy makes, let's say, a brahmachari transitioning out of saffron into white a more socially loaded, difficult task, depending on locale, I'll say, but historically, if we go back to like my parents' generation, like I don't think there was very many sort of gentle, encouraging instances of taking off saffron and opting into white. And the reason, again, this is important is because offending is not inevitable. And so some portion of people who offend may not have if they had a circumstance that was actually more suitable to them, like a consensual adult relationship in this instance. The already bad reputation within the organization just further kind of snowballs to discourage disclosures of abuse. If someone's been abused and they look around and see all the things that we've seen over the last few years and decades, but like in social media, these things have been being discussed more in these last few years. If I'm someone who was also abused, let's say by a more random sort of someone who was a temple president for a couple of years or something, and I look around and see this is the response, like I'm going to not disclose. And by not disclosing, the people who committed abuse are there to continue doing so.
Is the reaction that we generally witness around ISKCON very similar to the reaction that happens everywhere, or is there a unique kind of problematic response that we see in ISKCON?
I think that the like emotional reaction, like the impulse to evade, cover, minimize, that's pretty universal, because power does not readily like to dissipate from itself. But also, I think there's some unique factors around being a heavily proselytizing mission, and therefore the consideration of public image looms very large in how and if we respond to something. Because yes, okay, it's bad that this person was abused, but it's also bad that dozens of people have their faith harmed if it's found out. And so those decisions are made in favor of that expediency, the sort of immediate comfort at the cost of long-term safety and health of the organization. So I think there are some uniquely bad. And then if you want to say, like, I would say it's very similar to the Catholic Church, but now in a lot of ways we're probably behind them in setting up systems to address it, because again, there's been less demand and less scrutiny. I seem to have cut off my next point, so I don't know what I was going to say there historically. Yeah, I'll come back to that later on. Other factors that might exacerbate abuse, as we just said, the response to it or lack thereof, which emboldens abusers and discourages victims. The continued power of known abusers, which does the same thing. Rhetoric about forgiveness, rising above quarrel, is very easy to weaponize, to suppress, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. And similarly, like you said, ideas about offensiveness that sort of prevent the discussions that need to take place for people to make sense of a situation of deep betrayal. We need to talk to other people and confirm our own perception and tweak it and refine it. And if that is avoided because of offenses, then we're harming the effort for safety.
Just to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, I meant to actually follow it up then.
Mm-hmm.
Can you think of any environments in the secular world where, in spite of someone misusing their position to commit abuse, and especially in a position of spiritual sanctity, spiritual leadership, spiritual trust, that they've just, the investigating body or whatever, has simply said, let's just keep him there. Let's just allow that person to continue. To me, it defies belief, really.
I mean, this is, yes, yeah. I mean, that's very common in secular organizations, and some of the research we'll touch on comes from those environments. When I talk about institutional betrayal, that is from research conducted in college campuses among students who experienced sexual assaults. And when they reported, the research is, how did the response to their report and disclosure of abuse ultimately impact them? What was the response and what impact does that have? And so when the response is invalidating, minimizing, doubting, cover up, the long-term negative psychological effects are greater for those people than the ones who didn't report in the first place. So one of the points we'll make a bit later is by behaving this way, the organization is just piling on additional harm. It's not just like failing to get justice for a bad apple. It is failing to be the sort of moral system for recourse when injustice has already occurred.
Its own hands are necessarily dirty now. Like it can't.
And I would say this is extremely common in secular organizations, and we see so many scandals come out, and often when a story comes out like an Epstein, what we find out is, oh, this issue had bubbled to the surface at a point prior within a smaller realm of awareness, and then sort of been ignored and tamped down, and the person was continued to have was allowed to continue to have power. And so unfortunately, yes, abuse occurs everywhere, and really poor response to abuse can occur everywhere, and still that is never a very relevant response for someone to make when we're talking about the specifics of problems here. You know what I mean? It's like, yes, they exist elsewhere too. There's people in those places having these conversations as well, hopefully.
Got a comment here from Saraswati, just acknowledging what you said. Long-term harm to victims is worse when they report, and then the organization and those reported to minimize, cover up.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a really powerful perspective and set of studies and information. So this is like my most passionate and sort of the things we're talking about today. Delving into this is really important to me. So I want to take us, like I said, beyond the act of abuse, the physical moment or whatever it may be, because we have this tendency to focus on the act and not the larger impact, which is what is most relevant if we're talking about suffering and preventing and reducing it. And the act can take a variety of forms. Sometimes it's not violent. Sometimes it's even seemingly consensual, as I discussed, or even physiologically enjoyable. And here, to your point about sort of unique harms and facets of sexual abuse as opposed to physical abuse or psychological abuse, this is one of them, that a victim may have felt pleasure in the process, and that becomes further confusing, further destabilizing, the extreme source of shame. And I'll talk more about shame in a little bit. So what unites almost all forms of child sexual abuse, given that they're not all violent, they're not always forceful, at least in appearance, etc. So let's say, you have abuse by clergy, abuse by a school teacher, a youth serving professional, or abuse by family. And what is at the center of all of them is the betrayal. It's that these relationships are something different than abuse, and now abuse is also occurring within them. And how do I harmonize pain, harm, mistreatment from the person who is supposed to love me, guide me spiritually, whatever it may be? And that is the crux of betrayal trauma theory, developed in the 90s, specifically around child sexual abuse. That is kind of the origin of this theoretical framework. And so what it says in brief is that mistreatment or abuse that is perpetrated by someone in a role of care, love, responsibility has greater and longer lasting negative impact than abuse that occurs from someone where that is not the context of the relationship, or where it's a single one-off experience. So there's this concept of psychological schemas, which is basically like we piece together like packages of information, and that's how we start to make sense of the world. And so in development, these schemas are forming, like sort of connecting ideas, connecting the implications of certain behaviors. And so what happens when there's abuse occurring developmentally is the love and care schema is developed with abuse mixed into it, especially if it's developmental, as distinct from someone who grows up not being abused, has a schema around love and care that excludes abuse, and then abuse occurs, and it may be easier to identify. Here, if it's as a child is growing, it's sort of establishing a base schema that's already deeply skewed, and will be all the harder to sort of shift later. And so, what are you going to say?
Well, I was sort of thinking of, the child that goes to Gurukul, possibly thinking, hearing all these messages about the fortune of their birth, taking birth in a devotee family, best opportunities, love of Godhead, love of all jivas, but then being this stark contrast. It's not just hypocritical, but if I understand what you're saying here about schemas, it's such a mismatch. What to speak then is if one of the trusted individuals, someone positioned as a saintly person,
Yep.
crosses boundaries, and even these might be boundaries that haven't been, the child might have heard about sex in a Bhagavatam class and still not known what it is.
Right.
Now, all
right.
of a sudden,
right.
Something strange is going on, and I imagine the level of betrayal is extraordinary.
In the movie Spotlight about child sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, there's this amazing line where the guy says, "How do you say no to God?" Talking about being abused by a priest, God's representative. Yes, you are so right. And this is a big place where shame comes in. So just to touch on this last bullet point, not only does this result in, there's things that we know result from what the ACEs study, it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And so that's sort of, yes, known: depression, anxiety, dissociative, even like diabetes, physiologically worse outcomes long term. But there's this other side also, like work and education impairment, substance misuse. But then there's also this deep identity disturbance and social disconnection and shame. And so in the betrayal trauma framework, how shame is understood is, if this person loves me and this person makes me feel horrible, the only thing that makes sense of that is I somehow deserve it. I'm not sure why. I may not be able to suss that out, but the only way those two things can exist is if I deserve it. And so shame becomes a way to make sense of what is make sense of a situation where we are mentally unable to put the blame where it actually belongs, for some of the reasons you're talking about.
I mean, we should probably have full research at some point as to the life outcomes of those devotees who went to Gurukula. What proportion of them, were able to recover their lives and actually,
and I mean, I would push back a little bit in that mostly how this plays out, abuse victims are not they're not categorically different. The reality is, it's not often recovered life or not. It's like both things continue to exist. And
yeah.
I'm sure we both know lots of adults who were in gurukuls who have really amazing, inspirational, and happy lives. And at the same time, some of what they experienced still can crash in on them, or when a case like this becomes in the news cycle, or the devotee news cycle again, it could be deeply destabilizing, or when certain special events occur, their abuser dies, their abuser is worshipped, and it's aired all over the internet, like all of those things. And so part of better supporting survivors of abuse is also understanding their adversity, like, can coexist with their success.
Thank you.
Here's just a little illustration of this concept of betrayal trauma. So one axis is social betrayal, and one is terror or fear inducing. And these are traumatic incidents that, like, might result in PTSD and other traumatic symptoms. And so we see here that the higher the betrayal and the higher the fear, the more extreme impact. And so I would contend that we have systemic instances of sadistic abuse in some of these stories, as well as instances of, maybe less terror, fear inducing along this spectrum. There's the full range, probably. But when it's like systematic in a school environment, things get pretty distorted, and I think sadistic is an appropriate term.
It is shocking sometimes to hear how commonplace some of the cruel and unusual punishments were. If a child soiled their underpants, made to wear them on their head. If a child threw up, made to eat it up. This wasn't happening at one location only. It's actually very hard to fathom how either these methodologies were propagated in some ways, or whether just we have a particular kind of sadistic individual that managed to inveigle themselves into these roles.
I would contend a third, which is the methods of control are very universal across cultures and relationships. Humiliation, shaming, sleep deprivation, inadequate food, like all of these things are known in situations where people are intentionally trying to break someone down. These are employed conscientiously. And in situations where people are just seeking maximum expediency of control, these start to sort of naturally arise. And I do think, you may have instances of people. I mean, you have people in the movement who came out of the military, and a lot of these dynamics are employed in a military setting. It's like I said, control has these very consistent features. And so I think that it's a bit of the frog in the boiling water situation, where it is not that every teacher who became a horrible abuser had that like degree of violence preset in them. Maybe some did, and we hear about certain figures in ISKCON history who seemed like their role was to be a thug or enforcer from jump, but many that is not the case, and they still became active or complicit participants in these really extreme abuses, going all the way back, of course, to Dallas Gurukul, to the very beginning.
Just a quick comment here. Someone's saying, I just want to point out that Gurukul had no sense of developing healthy relationships with the opposite sex. Our own mothers were told by our authorities to be lesser, and lust the primal sin that kept us in bondage. We were ridiculed in Gurukul for admitting you liked a girl, and we had no idea what lay ahead in regards to attraction to girls and the path our lives would take to get married. I think that excessive brahmachari and sannyasi culture made ISKCON a ripe environment for abuse.
I absolutely agree. And I would say my own experience is somewhat like that, in that I grew up in a very liberal devotee family, kind of fringy at the time I was growing up. But there was no discussion of sex. There was this attitude from my mother of sort of like fear or suspicion of interaction with girls, beginning at an age so young that is like not appropriate, because I went to public school and so on. And so I experienced some of that. And then as I was growing older, closer to pursuing dating and relationships, it wasn't all conscious, but that was deeply intimidating. And that's part of what motivated me to become a brahmachari. It was like, I don't know how to address or navigate this part of life. And hey, here's a perspective that says, don't bother. It's better to just forego it all.
Just someone saying, even in Mayapur, that it's there on their radar. Sorry to interrupt you, Prabhu. Please keep
No,
up.
that's great. No, I get worked up. Please interrupt as needed. Here, I hate reading long slides, but I'm going to do it because it's really important to synthesize these things. And this is a woman who experienced child sexual abuse in her own words, from this book, about why we fail to see betrayal, or how it's obscured for our safety. So they said, when I think about the word betrayal, she said, I think of a lie, a pretense, whether it comes from family or society or whatever, of an unexpected norm, of an expected norm, sorry. And when that gets skewered and manipulated and twisted, and, you know, for me, I was abused in many ways by many people in my family. The biggest betrayal for me was the normalization, that there's this incredible lie going on, that parents are supposed to love you and keep you safe. And in my experience, those were the most dangerous people I've ever experienced in my life. Throughout my entire life, I have ridden with motorcycle gangs, I've lived with ex-cons, I've done incredibly stupid things because of that. But the dangerous people were the ones who were supposed to love. But the dangerous people were the ones who were supposed to love means were supposed to keep me safe. There's a typo there, but you get the gist. And, you know, that manifested in horrific physical abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse, and spiritual abuse. And I'm reminded of the ways earlier generations of Gurukulis were demonized and dismissed for becoming unruly adolescents, as if there was any other way for things to go, given the sort of inputs they were given. And, you know, in this quote, sub in that parents are supposed to love you and keep you safe, with that swamis, gurus, whomever, are supposed to love you and keep you safe. And it's the same principle with even larger cosmic spiritual ramifications than the betrayal of one's parents. So briefly on betrayal blindness, it's described as what occurs when the stakes of knowing are too high. So the theory is that betrayal is basically intolerable. To be aware that someone is betraying us day in, day out, we can't live like that. And so when we become conscious of a betrayal, we're in a position that we either want to confront it or escape from it. And when those aren't available, which is often the case for a child, because confrontation might just be more dangerous or fruitless, and escaping might be physically impossible if you're a child in a boarding school or just in your home. So when there is no way to do that, betrayal blindness is a survival mechanism that basically allows us to live day in, day out in what is otherwise intolerable circumstances.
Are the psychological effects of doing that just deciding that you're sort of putting this distance between you and this dreadful thing that's happening to you? Does that kind of numb you in other ways?
So I would say what I just described is not at all a conscious process. It's not. It may at times start to bubble, and this is like what cognitive dissonance is like, start to bubble to the awareness, but like, wait, if I reappraise this person's behavior as X, the implications are Y, Z, and that's like deeply destabilizing to me. And so let me just like kind of calm down, put it away. And in the study of kind of coercion and manipulation, there's a term called like a thought terminating cliche, which is like a phrase or a concept that discourages these sort of dangerous questions. So if in a question section of a lecture, someone wants to stand up and bring up child abuse, and they're told, that's in the mode of ignorance, or you're being offensive. You're being offensive would be a great example of something that can be used as a thought terminating cliche. The implications of committing Vaishnav aparad are so aversive that if you're telling me that's the route I'm on, let me just back up right now. And so I would say this is not typically a conscious decision, but yeah, it has implications in terms of continuing abuse. And then I would say it has implications in terms of the rest of this person's life, their ability to discern these things being more clouded because they've sort of become habituated to not seeing it.
Thank you.
And then shame is a core component in this, and I touched on that because shame becomes the thing that makes this all, at least at surface level, logically coherent for the person. And then we get to institutional betrayal. And so after someone who is supposed to love and care for us betrays us, hopefully we have these systems for seeking justice and seeking support. That's the police, the GBC, the CPO maybe. And then for support, it's things like being believed in your community, receiving adequate psychological care, resources to access that, whatever it may be. And so when that doesn't happen, as I mentioned, research shows that victims experience even worse outcomes. And so we're in a situation here with decades of this having occurred. And maybe we'll talk about this more, but something I think is really important to emphasize to leaders and members is like, this is going to get worse before it gets better. Not that the behavior is necessarily going to get worse, but if we're truly changing, that means becoming more fully aware of what's actually occurred. And that means more problems actually coming to light. And so any plan of action that's put out, and the recent one that was sort of announced on the ISKCON news site or something I skimmed through, has to start with going deeper into excavating the harm that's been done, not into immediately strategizing how do we address what we're aware of now, because there is more, and we know that both in Mayapur and elsewhere. And so I mention that because I think that is scary, and understandably so, to many people who don't want the movement harmed, etc. But like, it's the difference between short-term and long-term health, or not even short-term health, the short-term facade of health, or the long-term actual presence of health.
This may be unfair to throw at you on the spur of the moment, but do you have any case studies of organizations that did face these did the excavation work, did decide at some point that they were going to just deal with it and have come through it?
I would say yes. Those processes never are perfect, even in the best case scenario. They're never going to satisfy everyone. They're always going to have some shortcomings, but there are some instances. So one is, recently the Southern Baptist Convention, it's SBC, I think it's convention, like the organization that kind of oversees Southern Baptism, which is a very individualistic sect, commissioned an outside report, a lengthy report that was then published. And I think this is essential. Any report has to be public in full. Absolutely. And it had major implications. I didn't follow it too closely. Another example that's maybe even more appropriate and relevant is within Kundalini Yoga. In 2020, there had been decades of whispers that the founder of Kundalini Yoga, whose name is escaping my mind, had been a sexual predator, and it became a sort of thriving sect and business as a yoga practice over many decades. And then in 2020, a woman published a memoir explaining how, as the personal assistant to Yogi Bhajan, that was his name, Yogi Bhajan, she experienced sexual predation and abuse, and then so many others did. And it began this cascade, and there was this whole community in turmoil, people who are fully committed members, but also people who just are certified in the technique and it's their business. Lots of stuff unfolding. Ultimately, one of the things that the organization did was commission an organization called an Olive Branch, I think. It's like a conflict resolution organization, to conduct a study and write a report. And they interviewed many survivors, etc. Were there shortcomings in the report? Yes, of course. They then created a therapy fund, which doesn't always work. I've seen instances of people having issues with that, or feeling like they wanted to collect too much private information to give them money. So it's never going to be perfect, but in the name of it never being perfect, like, you should shoot for that as far as possible. And to me, that means for ISKCON, not only an outside party leading this, but even the selection of the outside party needs people in the room who haven't been there. The people who are considered sort of adversarial because they are promoting child protection, maybe you, for example, they need to be co-making these decisions, because the idea that the people who were in charge, the problem happened on their watch, and they were either did not care to address it or did not perceive it. And the idea that they then have the skills and perception to correct it is ludicrous to me, and something you see in a lot of organizations, even non-religious ones, when problems come to light.
Yeah, thank you. Please continue. Excuse my routine interruptions.
No, I don't mind, as long as you don't. I don't know how, we didn't even discuss how long we were going to go, but
I'll be guided by you. Generally,
okay.
we go somewhere between 90 minutes, 2 hours. So
Okay. So then looking at institutional courage. So these are, so the same woman who developed betrayal trauma theory then went on to develop betrayal blindness theory, all of these with corresponding studies. She's at the University of Oregon, very well established. Then she went on to develop the institutional betrayal. And then, like, if we take all these insights about how people and institutions behave badly, and we invert them, what can we learn about how to do better? And that's the basis for institutional courage. So the 10 sort of principles of it: comply with criminal laws and civil rights. I think that ISKCON's sort of rule books say that it's not enough for an organization, and it also has to be actually done for it to matter, but at least they do want that to be the case. Respond sensitively to victim disclosures. For this to happen, we're talking significant culture change over time, and that happens most effectively if it starts with the leaders, and them really understanding what this does and how you appropriately respond to it. Because otherwise, I don't care if they're sincere, they're just speculating, they're just sort of riffing. What I've observed online is a lot of people kind of sharing ideas, which is positive, but also, like, we need to bring in the outside perspective, the established norms.
Just on that one, responding sensitively, does that require training? Is that something that can just come from intuition, or is it just people need to be empathic, or do they actually need to be professionally trained?
I would say some people have a very good sort of default approach. Responding sensitively to adults who are disclosing historic abuse is less intricate than responding sensitively to children. And I have a slide a little later about responding to children specifically, because yes, that does, I think anyone can benefit from training. Jennifer Freyd has a great guide on how to be a good listener, and like how to react to traumatic disclosures, what you say, what you don't say, what body language to exhibit. And that's between adults, but even more so with kids, it becomes really important. This may be my favorite one: cherish the whistleblower. If an organization is at a point where they're able to actually do this, to me, that probably signals a lot of health. What we see is, of course, the opposite. And I know even years ago, just from commenting on one of Saraswati's threads, I received a threat in my messages, and I'm like a degree removed. There's someone at my door. I'm going to try to ignore it and hope they go away.
Tell us a little bit more about Bear Witness. Item 3.
This kind of goes along with responding sensitively. This is a broad statement. Be accountable and apologize. Like, to truly be accountable means all the things we're talking about in taking action. But even just in that first moment, don't try to like explain all these things away, And I definitely heard some of that from some of the speakers in the recent meeting, or like minimizing their own role in them. It is a sign of strength, and it is faith restoring when a leader owns the reality of something. It really is strong, not weak. Engage in self-study. I think this may be what is partly being initiated if they're going to commission this report, etc. But because of our starting point, which is like a really bad position in terms of accountability systems and sort of conflicts of interest, I think the self-study has to include third party assisting that self-study. I don't think that the systems are strong enough to trust it internally yet. Conduct anonymous surveys. This could be huge if people are truly given a way to feel safe, to give their candid feedback, and it's taken seriously. So much insight can be gleaned. And I have a few ideas later about things people might do to sort of start doing that better. Make sure leadership is educated on research about trauma. This is a huge one. Again, I would argue this should not come from internally. I see people talking about how there's a devotee who's a clinical social worker in America, and maybe she can lead support groups, etc. The notion that like the internal resources and expertise is enough for the scale of this problem is really a poor idea, I think. And I don't know any mental health professional who's also a devotee, awesome. But there are some intrinsic conflicts of interest there. In them being the care providers. Is their guru friends with a guru who was complicit in the cover-up? Like, it's too familial in a sense, I think, to be the default or only option given to survivors. Be transparent about data and policy. That sort of speaks for itself and is certainly not what has occurred. And we see so much, leaked communications coming out to set the record straight about misleading communications that are put out beforehand, etc. And use the power. So this is in like a company context to address the societal problem. Devotees may or may not feel like that speaks to them. I think if you are a public proselytizing organization who is truly concerned about and delivering on child protection, then that will also have a positive impact in the realms that you participate. Sometimes in nonprofits, if their mission is child protection, they have certain standards of their partners who they'll partner with or not, based on, does that organization have a code of conduct or whatnot? And so you can use your power to sort of affect change beyond that. And then, perhaps most importantly, commit resources to these. Money, because that is the evidence in my mind that this is being taken seriously, and that an attempt is being made for an adequate response, because this will never be addressed through volunteers. I'm happy to share my time and help. This is not going to solve our problems until money is there. And like I said, it comes down to literally the physical design of buildings, being thoughtful about that and how that does or doesn't facilitate one-on-one interactions with children. Any thoughts before I dig into the more?
No, keep going for a minute.
Okay. So some general risks. I didn't get to flesh these out as much as I had hoped in time, but like I said, isolated one-on-one environments, the normalizing of boundary violations. So
could you say a little bit more about that one?
Yeah. So maybe forcing a child to hug or touch or engage with the visiting Swami. In general settings, we talk about like forcing kids to give hugs to relatives, etc., and sort of changing that norm and setting a norm of asking a kid's permission and honoring their comfort level. And what that does is it's not just like, oh, we prevented them from touching right now. It's about teaching a kid that they have power to establish a safe environment and that the environment will respond appropriately to that, versus my discomfort is irrelevant, is not going to be heard, and so I'm just going to learn to stuff that down. And then a couple years later, when if that person's in a situation of more overt potential abuse, this sort of schema of this isn't going to be heard or taken seriously is already taking root.
What if it's not force? What if it's simply, someone who's excessively physically affectionate? It might possibly have no ulterior motive, but it's still establishing a precedent that this level of affectionate touch is okay.
Well, I think forced is also just very hard to even ascertain for children. If my parents are worshiping the person who they're now asking to hug me, like, it can be hard for a kid to even know how they feel. They're being told how they should feel about this interaction. That's special mercy. And so I guess maybe what you're alluding to is it doesn't matter. Like, better would just be to set up codes of conduct that preclude those things in the first place. Because again, yeah, even if that individual is not a problem or concern, mild discomfort is not desirable, but also they're normalizing behaviors that people who are a real concern also utilize, and sort of desensitizing the community to those things. Undereducated adults, specifically about child protection, but also about maybe intimacy and healthy relating. I don't know that adults, especially ones who maybe were born in ISKCON, have always, as someone said in the comments, like in the Gurukul, there was nothing about what is an okay form of love and care and affection. Weak child safety culture, we've discussed this. Lack of education, like we just said, about the alternatives, not just this is bad, this is bad, this is bad. This is what okay looks like also. This is what okay looks like. Some unique risks for ISKCON, in my view: the already established history of abuse and non-response, which I already explained, sort of discourages people addressing it, moving on. The fact of a preaching mission, and therefore the very strong ability to sort of minimize individual pain to prevent what is seen as in a sense, a larger scale of suffering in the potential loss of faith. And I think that this is just something devotees like have to contend with and think about. And some of this stuff is going to rise to the level of like theological work to think through and understand things differently, because on some level, if child abuse is a material thing, but the result of airing it is the sort of spiritual delay of dozens, hundreds, thousands of people, you can see why the calculus comes out in the wrong direction sometimes. And so I think that's just something that has to be thought about and contended with. And then ignorant leadership, and by that I mean ignorant to trauma, ignorant to child safety, not like a name calling, but uneducated, untrained. Prohibitions against gossip, similar to the offenses kind of idea. If we do not get more detailed about what does or doesn't constitute offensive talk, then we prevent people from really vital conversations about their and their children's well-being. Notions of purity, that there's a missing P here, that prevent voicing concerns. So obviously, like I said, if a child is abused by their uncle and they're worried, oh, the implications, if I tell the family, if a child's abused by a sannyasi, it's like, wow, I'm going to upend so many people's lives if I'm believed, which is what you hope for. So even in the good scenario of being believed, the person who's abused is aware of and feels the weight of sort of being the messenger of this devastating truth. And so to your point about things that discourage disclosure, that's a big one.
Mm.
I think people have to be honest about historical norms that included polygamy and child marriage. And I am not saying to litigate what was and wasn't okay in the past and in other cultures. But if we're talking about establishing norms for now and for the situation we're in, recognizing that these things are part of a legacy is important to understanding why we're so bad at addressing it. Because they're, I would say, here we go. Like, let's compare this to secular society, even to other religions. I would say within ISKCON, it is probably the case that there is a larger portion of people who are amenable to the notion of child marriage because of historical things. I would say there's a larger portion of people who are amenable to polygamy, etc. And you see these conservative movements in the past, like the ISKCON reform movement and things, which are just a very sort of authoritarian orientation towards relationships and family. So I do think those are some unique things that arise in an ISKCON community or a devotee community more broadly. Yeah, I should say, I don't think this only applies to ISKCON. It's just ISKCON is the largest Gaudiya community there is. The exaltation of tolerance, mercy, equanimity. Again, we gotta define how far a concept goes and where it ends and other concepts come in. And so the turning of the other cheek in the Christian context is so readily weaponizable. And so that, I would love to see if someone explaining the Shikshastakam in a lecture then also takes a moment to explain what is tolerating too far or what might be mistaken for tolerance, and should not be tolerated. And that level of sort of more specific and relevant preaching should be going on, not just the more theoretical.
Could you say something about the karma kind of angle? Because obviously this is also something. Oh, there you go.
You're so good. Yeah, I think that this is a philosophical issue that is sticky and tough and has to be contended with. If on some level the notion is that via karma things are happening as they should be, that can really sort of hobble the pursuit of justice. It can excuse people from feeling like they need to be the agent of that justice, because on the cosmic ledger it all zeroes out anyway, and it also can create horrible response. I know of someone who was abused as a kid who was told by a prominent figure in their community that it's because they had abused someone in a past life. I remember when some child abuse stuff came on Facebook a few years ago, and a prominent thinker quoted the verse about if you eat a cow, like being reborn as many times as her hairs on the back. It's just this very uncompassionate, mechanistic, mathematical, well, if it happened, it must have been caused by something, and so like somehow it makes sense or is okay. So I'm not here to try to do the philosophical, theological kind of work, but I think that you see this happening in a Catholic setting. You see people grappling with how can we, at every level, including how we're espousing our beliefs, do so in a way that is better for children and keeps them safer.
You said already that in the young mind that's dealing with betrayal, the tendency to think I deserved it is already a sort of a psychological sort of heuristic that often is resorted to. So it sounds like reinforcing that philosophically by saying, well, Bhagavad Gita basically agrees that you deserved it. Surely that's really compounding shame and those other problematic feelings.
Yeah. And I happen to notice someone in the comments said child abuse is not a philosophical issue. I entirely agree. But the way child abuse plays out and the way culture changes does involve philosophy as well. And so, you know, I don't know if I want to name names or not. I can think of in the last decade a prominent ISKCON leader and guru who published an entire book espousing very regressive relationships with women and children and child labor and things like that. And so while that was not endorsed by the society at large, that person was not pulling those ideas out of thin air. They have their rationale, they have their scriptural quotations, etc. And we can't pretend like we don't have to contend with those arguments in trying to change the overall culture.
Thank you.
Some warning signs for abuse. Physical signs are less common, you know, things like soreness, redness, abrasions around the genitals, the presence of a sexually transmitted infection. A bit more common is sort of like psychosomatic physiological manifestations, like a chronic stomachache or headache that has no other sort of medical explanation. Far more common are these emotional and behavioral warning signs: withdrawal, depression, unexplained anger, especially if any of these are like a sudden shift, nightmares, bedwetting at certain ages, cruelty to animals, bullying others or being bullied, self-harm, sexual behavior and language that's not age appropriate. So I know, at least in the past, that sort of generational recursive, if that's the right word, abuse occurred. And so you had kids who had been abused who were obviously aware of things that were not developmentally appropriate, especially when you consider the average lack of sex education, like all the more so that these kids would not. Where is that coming from? This is a little harder to gauge now with the internet because sexual behavior and language gets accessed that way too. Early use of
So just to be clear as well, these are warning signs that something possibly has transpired, as opposed to red flags that might. Do we also discuss those at some point? What are they?
I don't have a slide. We can touch on those. But yes, cool. The warning signs are things that should trigger further questioning. And I'm going to talk about what that should look like.
Okay, cool.
Red flags are in a sense warnings. I mean, if you've observed abuse, then it's like we're past the suspicion stage entirely. Red flag behaviors would be like boundary violations. So one of the things we teach in one of the trainings that I am authorized to facilitate is this process like between adults, because adults need to be policing each other. It's not on kids to always know and prevent their own harm. You see an adult behaving with a kid in a way that makes them uncomfortable, and you set the boundary. You like stop the behavior, set a boundary, say like, oh, we don't really like do sitting on laps here, and then you move on. You don't assume that this sign is evidence of nefarious intent, but because you've very clearly set up what the behavior expectation is, if that then continues to happen, the hue of that flag is like getting more and more red, because what it's showing is a willingness to go against sort of stated expectations. This is also why codes of conduct are extremely important, and everyone should know them, because that empowers people to hold others accountable. So it's not just like, hey, I'm going to approach you and say something that feels like an accusation that you're a pedophile, basically, versus I'm going to approach you and say, hey, remember like when we did the series of meetings at the temple and we established this code of conduct, and this was not one of the behaviors, like this is prohibited. So like, not assuming bad things about you, but here's a reminder. And then if that keeps happening, then the response needs to escalate. So in response to warning signs, the suspicion of abuse, you want to ask for more information, create rapport, allow for silence in that interaction, but also you want to set a stage of talking about these things with children so that if something happens, their sense is you are always there as a resource, no matter how outlandish it might seem. The messaging to children should be, if anyone ever makes you uncomfortable in how they're interacting with you, how they're touching you, I don't care who it is, I don't care what the implications are, I'm going to be here to help you sort through that. And so making yourself the go-to person, and then when that potentially happens, not jumping to conclusions. And so in the suspicion of abuse, you want to sort of ask further. I noticed you've been behaving XYZ way lately, like, is anything going on? And to that point, I just want to touch on here, too perfect behavior is really important to understand, that this can also be the way a child manages a trauma and betrayal circumstance, is just being exemplary. And so it's not that warning signs are always obviously negative. So that's suspicion of abuse. If there's an actual disclosure of abuse, it's very important to ask open-ended questions and to moderate your response. Children are taking their cues for what this means. Again, it could have been a situation where there was no physical pain, there was like some weirdness, or they were like, I don't know, this seems even kind of neutral to me, but I know that I was told this was wrong. Not reacting in the worst way may be helpful to helping your child manage the situation. As we said at the outset, it is not a given that any instance of abuse means the worst of outcomes. So if my body language is immediately the worst of outcomes, that's sort of setting the stage for like, this is how we're going to understand what happened. So moderating that response, and asking open-ended questions, also because children typically will give a little bit of information and see how that's landing, see if it's going to be accepted, and then have more to say. And so that space for silence is really, truly crucial. In the US, and I imagine almost all places, it's really important to ask open-ended questions, because if you ask more directive questions, you can compromise a potential criminal case, because the argument will be that you sort of steered a child to think this way. And so I'll speak in an American context. If I had a child in a devotee community and I suspected abuse, or they told me of abuse, I would ask some questions to understand sort of the immediate setting, where this is coming from, how do I keep you safe? But in America, there's child advocacy centers where there's special trained forensic interviewers, because it really, really is a skill to collect the kind of information that can hold up in court. And so if a crime has occurred, you need to report that. And if you have any hope of pursuing legal justice, that forensic interview needs to occur. And the sooner it occurs, the better, in terms of you not distorting the testimony, and in terms of then freeing you up to have a more open conversation, because we've taken care of this legal thing. In America, the way it works is a child only has to tell that experience once to a social worker, and it's being filmed, and there's a police officer and an advocate and like a multidisciplinary team observing it in real time, so that a kid doesn't have to tell the cop, then tell the social worker, then tell this one, then tell that one. And so it's really designed to minimize the sort of secondary traumatization. So
can that even itself even freak a kid out, where they've, got some sense something was wrong, they've opened up to their parents, and now all of a sudden recording, strangers interviewing? I mean, how do you help a child in such an instance just cope with all of that?
Yeah, so I'll speak to America, which I know is not universal. Like this isn't. There's not all these systems set up in India, for example. Obviously, here child advocacy centers are all designed. Again, even the physical building designed with children in mind. So it's like a playful environment. It's like when I was a kid and I would go to the dentist, they had like arcade games and stuff like that. It's like a playful environment. The forensic interviewer is often a younger person. The camera is not obvious usually. They try to minimize that, but you're right. There's some destabilization. But if this is the temporary intervention that ends what would have been ongoing abuse, it's all a net gain, so to speak. Child advocacy centers also often, if they're well resourced, have support for the parents, potentially for other children in the household. So they really try to take a holistic approach and support the whole family, understanding what you're saying about like just the impact of the process being threatening or scary. Expressing belief, support, appreciation for them sharing. Again, this is about reinforcing this is what you're going to be met with when you share something difficult with me. So even if this instance isn't like a horrible one, maybe something else happens further down the line. This also applies for like concerns around online sexting and things like that. There's a huge problem now of sextortion, kids and adults being manipulated into sending nudes and then being blackmailed for them. And so if you've set up the precedent so that your kid knows, even though that was really bad, you're going to try to support them from that point onward for the best possible outcome, there's a greater chance that they'll come to you for help. And we have in North America kids committing suicide over these blackmail situations.
Just exploring this belief, that responding to the report with belief. Sometimes it's debated that, well, some of these wouldn't meet standards of evidence that would secure a conviction in court. What, are we just going to believe anything anybody says? And
it's hilarious to me that when convenient, devotees who are taking that stance will fully embrace the authority of the state and the legal system as if it's infallible. And at other times, like, we're above all of that. I would say the standard of conduct for criminality is a low, low, low bar. That is not the standard of conduct for the organization, which is much higher. So something doesn't need to meet the legal threshold for it to be actionable within ISKCON. The law does not care that someone took a vow of celibacy and then violated it, but the faith and the community does, And so this, like, when convenient, sort of deferring to, like I said, like the evaluators or the legal authorities, it's like there's a double standard going on here in that sort of evasive maneuver. I think false reports are very uncommon. There's data about this, but more importantly, we're talking about children. If you care about the child who's disclosing abuse to you, the best thing you can do in that moment is believe them. You don't have to. Ultimately, there's going to have to be corroborating evidence for a legal thing. The notion that if someone's acquitted, we should assume they're innocent is absurd. I think people would readily acknowledge that, just logically speaking. Don't overpromise. A lot of times it's very disorienting. If you're a parent, you don't know what's going to happen. You can be somewhat honest about that. What you know is you're going to do everything in your power and take it seriously, and you can convey that. What you don't know is, will you achieve justice, etc. And then seeking out official channels. So, if that's the police, if that's a more functioning CPO, both of those, etc. And then find and provide evidence-based resources, whether therapy as well as psychoeducation sometimes, and various things. Here is my quickly put together sort of some ideas for, like, what do we do? How do we start to make these things more real? Because from what I can see, there is some real and growing momentum at the membership level, and some maybe progress in some parts of leadership. There's a lot of disagreement among leadership. I think that the change is going to have to come sort of from the bottom up and then back down. It's like the groundswell of people taking issue forces official channels to change systems, and then that filters back down into improved environments, etc. So my thinking is, don't wait for them to endorse a certain bit of a certain training. Or I saw a post in Vedic Inquirer about someone saying, like, yes, we need resources and education, but don't forget, like, the CPO does exist, and they need. I would contend, from my limited perspective, like, the CPO could not begin to address the scope of this issue, and, like, to wait for them, who ultimately does answer to a body that has been complicit in this, is not expedient. And so, like, things can move forward with buy-in from certain leaders or not. At least some things can.
A lot is made of that with the CPO. I mean, I have the highest regard for the devotees who are running the international CPO and so on, and CPTs all around the world, but they are severely constrained. Though there is some sense of still reporting to the GBC, and the GBC see themselves as the ultimate managing authority, because those words were used in a will. And therefore the CPO probably feel that they have to somehow work with. Mm-hmm. What do you feel about that? How do other organizations do this? Is there needs to be independence and independent funding?
It's a really great question, and I can't say if I know exactly how other organizations have tried to address this. Some ideas I would have is having a diversity of viewpoints is what's important to make sure they're all represented. And so rather than trying to create a cohesive CPO team, there should be some tension there, especially because this is a real problem in the society. So what I mean is, someone like me, not that I'm at all proposing I was on the CPO team, but I would be bringing, like, an outside perspective and pushing further. And so I think that the systems that are supposed to solve the problem, regardless of motives or anything, does not matter, have shown themselves insufficient for addressing the problem. So in my mind, there needs to be fresh blood, fresh perspective in these decision-making rooms from the very first stage. And so the announcement that was put out, if that was being done on a team with someone like myself, not even myself, someone more involved who's a child protection advocate, that announcement probably would have been better, because it would have had that pushback and that tension of perspective. So I think that that's really crucial and is part of insisting on transparent processes. Unless there are people who we know are not beholden to leadership in the process, we don't know that it's a transparent process. Even if the report, let's say a future report, is published in full, if the people receiving the draft of that report, editing that report, interacting directly with the people who did the ground research for that report, if they're all have some conflicts of interest, then our ability to have faith in the validity of the report that comes out is already less. So I think that it's just good all around for those different inputs. It's a really good question though, like how other organizations might handle that. I mean, some, like, there's ombudsmen, there's like but even ombudsmen are paid by the organization. There are some nonprofit effort, like consultation organizations, that are funded by grants. And so they may take a job of evaluating an organization, and that organization isn't even the source of the funding. And I think that that could be a really attractive way. Or, gosh, even an independent party, someone within ISKCON who has some money, who really cares about this issue, and they fund it. And so there's at least some distance between the GBC as the person giving the job and the GBC as the person under scrutiny, or as the organization under scrutiny. New people in the room, like I said, finances. I think about how much money is being spent at different temples every Sunday for standard parts of worship and decoration and food and so on. And I'm not saying any of that should stop, but I refuse to accept any notion of there not being money for this. It's a matter of people with money caring enough. And in that, it's also just a matter of gurus caring enough that the disciples of theirs with resources feel like, oh, this is a real act of service to my guru. This matters to them. I'm doing something really good for myself if I'm supporting this. Probably like the TOVP was presented to people. I was reading a thread that said, like, people traveled to temples all over to collect funds for the TOVP. Boycotts eventually, like if things don't happen, temples are composed of the energy and resources of the people that make them up. And so if action isn't taken, building a coalition of people who are prepared to take sort of organized steps. So, we're not going to donate anything until we see XYZ action take place, for example. Here's just a random sort of more off the wall idea, around Mayapur, around temples, start posting QR codes that take people to an anonymous form, back to the institutional courage, conducting anonymous surveys. It doesn't have to be done by the leaders. We can collect that information and share it with each other and begin building a more informed perspective with or without their endorsement. I feel like there's other ideas that I would have loved to sit longer and try to mine, but I don't know if you have any. And then this, I believe, is my last slide, which is just, these are all book titles, books that I would recommend. The last one is a organization, the Survivors Network for Those Abused by Priests. typically it's largely Catholic, but it is not limited to Catholic. I know the guy who runs like the local chapter where I live. It's a global organization. I think in some ways it might be one of the better ones for some devotees who were abused by people in roles of spiritual authority.
Yeah, well, and a massive thank you to you as well, Nitai, for such an exhaustive overview of different considerations for us. I'm hoping this can serve as a great awareness video that can do the rounds and so on. I'll have a look at some of the comments here and just flash them up to see if there's any that you would like to address. And this is our last call, I guess, if there's anyone who has questions for Nitai. And we're going to work backwards through them. Should we even be running boarding schools? We can already rule out that they work to make kids more Christian. So yeah, the efficacy of that approach is certainly not proven.
I would say about boarding, I mean, probably not. I think that, yes, that's a good point they made. But if the premise of them was to train up pucka adult devotees, that doesn't, at least not systematically, that's not serving that end. And so why would it even be there when, I guess if that's not the case, like being with one's parents and in a sort of more normal environment is very often going to be preferable, especially when we're talking about the just sheer distance. If it's parents who aren't living in the same area or country, even sometimes, all of those are increased risk.
So appreciative that, yes, this should be watched by others. A comment that as a teacher in the US public school system, this kind of training would always be required.
Yeah, can I comment just on that?
Yeah, go ahead.
In public schools, it's not enough to educate the leaders, especially given the track record right now. Like the ideal should be, I think every temple should be offering and promoting child abuse prevention trainings to the entire community. It should be mandatory for people who have a role of authority, and it should be promoted heavily to all others. Yeah, I just started thinking of some other points, but I'll leave that aside.
Someone also mentioning, yes, the bedwetting was a common phenomena, sort of echoing your point of this being a telltale sign.
Can I touch on, this is what I forgot to include, like some misperceptions and
yes, please.
kind of bad ideas, or not just bad, but so one is the portion of solving this problem, which is educating kids, is a very small portion. It is not kids' responsibility to be able to identify and rebuff adult manipulation, which is what this often is. It's not the act, it's the manipulation that precipitated the act. So while educating kids about healthy touch, etc., absolutely should be occurring, I've heard people bring up teaching kids without talking about teaching the parents. And I would say that is the more important first step. And more informed parents can better inform their kids themselves as well. Another conception I just want to, like, it's on dads to be better. I kind of view it as like this, like, kshatriya, like this is the problem. Like people aren't, like if your kid ends up abused, it's your fault. That's also not helpful or accurate. It's just very simplistic. The problem is not that men are not aggressive enough. That's closer to the source of a problem than the solution.
Yeah, thank you for the myth busting, because yeah, we certainly see some strange ideas going around, and as you're saying, sort of an immature understanding of ancient texts is often part of the challenge that seeps its way into the culture. All right, so just someone supporting that the hugging is really not the cultural tradition that
Right.
Others supporting the idea that cult of change, leadership education, a few comments like that.
Oh, here's one that's interesting.
This is a new one.
Well, no, it was one of the older ones about every abusive teacher in ISKCON claimed ultimate authority based on their connection to Prabhupada Krishna, even though their behavior wasn't even close to what. Yeah, that, like, I'm the representative, even if it's not like I'm the pure representative, still a huge amount of power. Like, I'm the local representative, or I'm the representative for you in this school, whatever it may be.
Yeah, that's compounding the abuse using spiritual abuse. And no wonder people get turned off Krishna consciousness if they feel it feeds it.
Wow, this comment. Oh, that breaks my heart. You know, that's like such human physiological. We need affection. We need comfort. That's awful. I also want to say I'm open to communicating with people who watch this, potentially virtual trainings for communities. There's different things that might be helpful. And people can feel free to reach out to me. My email was on the last slide before we took it down.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure the thread will get quite busy. People will watch it if they didn't catch it live. And it'll also go up on YouTube. So we'll try and keep you across all of the responses there. Actually, I think we might have read, I might have read that one earlier.
Yeah,
Just see if there's any towards the end.
I'm not seeing any.
Yeah, there's a couple coming on now. All right, so those are mostly thank yous. Nitai Prabhu, so grateful because I think that those who find the excavating work that you've referred to uncomfortable often try to just disparage the whole group as if, it's just muckraking and there's no legitimacy to the kind of concerns being raised. You've obviously helped us here get a really rounded understanding of, what's going on and the things that we can do about it. And like I say, I'm hoping that this can be a really, really widely distributed resource. I really appreciate you taking the time and trouble to put your thoughts together. And
I'm really happy. I've watched this unfolding over the last few years and had awareness prior to that. And yeah, it's very satisfying to me to be able to contribute something potentially uniquely beneficial to my community of origin.
Well, I think that, here we go, there's another one. Opinions of the three generation, meaning our kids, will anybody know them as current gurus? Okay, that might be a tricky one. How's it going to affect faith in the gurus and everything going forward? I'll leave it to you if you want to try and respond to that.
No, I'll leave that to others.
But it's a regular discussion item in the forum.
Yeah.
So look, let me express a hearty thanks to you, Nitai. Really appreciate you making the effort to do this, and I'm very, very confident lots of people are going to want to pick your brains further. Thank you for everyone for watching. Yeah, sorry.
Thank you for making the platform for this, in the entire group and for these discussions. That can't be understated how important that is.
I think it's an idea whose time has finally come. Let's hope so. Let's hope this momentum just carries it through. If you're watching, thank you for giving us your time and attention. Please share. Every resource actually that we generate here, we want to just do the rounds and escape on the internet and just do its thing. And this video in particular, I think, is a very, very powerful one. So on that note, I'll end the broadcast and wish everyone Hare Krishna and a Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year to everyone. Some people, maybe it already is if they're up late in India. I don't know. All right. Thank you. I look forward to whatever comes next and helping with that.